All right, let's jump into a deep dive on California's Proposition 2. This one's pretty important for voters to understand. I mean, it touches on education, taxes, infrastructure, the whole shebang. We've got a ton of research here, articles, opinions, really trying to get the full picture. So today we're going to equip you with everything you need to know to make an informed decision when you hit the ballot box.
One thing that really stands out to me right off the bat is that both the California Republican Party and the California Democratic Party support this proposition. That's not something you see every day. It suggests there's something deeper going on with this issue.
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely not your typical partisan battle. So let's break it down. Prop 2 is basically asking voters to say yes or no to a $10 billion bond measure. And this money would go towards funding repairs and upgrades for our K-12 schools and community colleges. Now, I know what some listeners might be thinking, don't we already pay taxes for schools? And the answer is yes, of course. But the way California funds school facilities is kind of, unique.
Yeah, California's system is different. It relies completely on bonds for school repairs, which means there's no permanent source of funding built into the state budget for this stuff. And to make matters worse, the last bond measure that was supposed to address this failed back in 2020. So that's created a massive funding gap.
So imagine you're a student, right? You're sitting in a classroom. Maybe there's a leaky roof or the AC's busted. It's sweltering hot. It's pretty hard to focus on schoolwork when you're worried about getting dripped on or passing out from the heat.
It's true, the learning environment matters.
And this isn't just some hypothetical scenario either. According to some of the research we've been looking at, something like 38% of California students are stuck in schools that don't meet basic safety standards.
Yeah, the Public Policy Institute of California has done a lot of research on this, and what they found is that these bad conditions really do have a negative effect on attendance, on student morale, even on academic performance. It's not just about, making things look pretty. It's about creating a space where kids can actually learn and succeed.
Exactly. It makes a huge difference. And that's where Prop 2 comes in. At least that's what it's promising. To fix these problems, make our schools safer, healthier, and better for learning. It's proposing $8.5 billion for K-12 schools and $1.5 billion for community colleges, with a focus on renovations, new construction, and modernizing older facilities. Think about the schools in your own neighborhood. Have you seen any that look like they need some TLC? Prop 2 is trying to tackle those kinds of problems head-on.
And it's not just about fixing what's already broken either. It's also targeting specific issues, like removing lead from the drinking water in schools, creating more classrooms for transitional kindergartens so we can expand early childhood education, and investing in career and technical education programs, getting students ready for the jobs of the future.
Yeah, it seems pretty comprehensive. And it's actually got a surprisingly broad base of support. We're talking everyone from the state superintendent of public instruction to teachers unions, the Chamber of Commerce, even some big newspapers across the state.
It really shows how much concern there is about the state of our school infrastructure. But of course, there's always another side to the story.
Right. There's always another side. So what are the main arguments against Prop 2?
Well, it's not that opponents don't think schools need fixing. Their issue is more about how we pay for it. They argue that instead of relying on these bonds, which is basically just borrowing money and then having to pay it back with interest, these repairs should be paid for through the normal state budget.
Okay, so it's more of a budgeting philosophy then. Like they'd rather see long-term financial planning instead of what they might see as a Band-Aid solution.
Exactly. And, they do have some valid points. California already has a huge amount of debt. And adding another $10 billion to that could have some serious consequences down the road.
Right. And then there's the impact on taxpayers. Because ultimately these bonds have to be paid back. And guess who foots the bill?
Exactly. And that's a major concern for groups like the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association and Reform California. They're worried that this is just going to lead to higher property taxes, which would be a big burden on Californians who are already dealing with a really high cost of living.
They're not just talking about vague concerns either. They point out that school districts often have to match a portion of the bond funds themselves. So it's not just the state's $10 billion, it's the potential for even more costs at the local level.
Exactly, it's a ripple effect. And then you have to consider the total cost of the bond over its entire lifespan. That initial $10 billion is just the principal, right? When you add in the interest, it's estimated to cost closer to $18 billion over 35 years. That's a huge difference.
Yeah, it's a big difference. So we've got this classic dilemma, urgent need for school repairs on one hand, concerns about fiscal responsibility and the burden on taxpayers on the other.
It's a tough one for sure, and it really highlights how important it is for voters to understand all sides of this issue before they cast their ballot.
Absolutely. Well said.
We've been talking a lot about the financial side of things, but there's another layer to this debate, something that gets into the long-term picture for California schools.
Are you talking about that declining enrollment thing? I've seen a few articles about it. It does seem kind of weird to be talking about building net of use schools when we have fewer students.
Yeah, that's a big point that opponents of Prop 2 bring up. The data from the California Department of Finance shows that public school enrollment has been dropping for like 6 years straight, and they're projecting this trend to continue.
It's not just a small dip either, right? The projections are talking about a potential decline of over 600,000 students by 2032.
Yeah, that's a huge shift. And it's not just K-12 either. Community colleges are seeing enrollment drops too.
So if we're going to have fewer students in the future, why spend all this money building more classrooms?
That's what opponents are saying. They argue that we should be focusing on using our existing facilities more efficiently, maybe even consolidating some schools. They also talk about exploring other models like online learning. They say that could be a more cost-effective way to adapt to these changing demographics.
Makes sense on the surface?
Yeah.
But I guess supporters of Prop 2 see it differently.
Yeah, they acknowledge the enrollment decline, but they say that doesn't change the fact that a lot of these schools are in really bad shape. So bad that they're practically unusable even if we did have enough students.
But you can't learn an empty stomach. Or maybe you can't learn a crumbling building either, right?
Exactly. And it goes beyond just fixing the obvious stuff. Supporters also say we need to modernize our schools, make sure they're equipped for 21st century education. Even if we have fewer students overall, we still need spaces for things like STEM education, career training, collaborative learning.
So they see it as more of an investment in the future.
Right, an investment in the quality of education in California. And they argue that having modern, updated facilities could actually help attract and retain students, so it might even help counteract that declining enrollment trend.
Interesting. It seems like both sides have valid points. I can see the argument for being cautious about building new schools when we might not need them. But I also understand the point about needing to make sure the schools we do have are safe and up to date.
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act. It really brings up this bigger question of how we adapt our education system to the changes happening in California. Do we stick with traditional schools, or do we need to embrace new models?
That's a big question. But for now, let's focus on the decision voters have to make right now. We've talked about the arguments for and against Prop 2, the financial side of things, the enrollment issue. But let's actually zoom in on the proposition itself. What does it say? How would this $10 billion actually be used?
Okay, so Prop 2 would basically give the state the green light to borrow $10 billion through general obligation bonds. $8.5 billion would go to K-12 schools, and $1.5 billion would go to community colleges. But it's not like they just get a giant check and can spend it however they want. There's a process for how this money gets distributed and used.
So it's not as simple as just handing over a pile of cash.
Nope, not at all. It works through a system of matching grants. This means that school districts have to put up some of their own money to get the state funding.
Oh, wait a minute. Didn't the opponents of Prop 2 mention something about this matching requirement? Something about it potentially leading to higher property taxes.
Yeah, they did. It's a valid point. The way it works is the amount a district has to contribute depends on the type of project and how much money the district already has. Wealthier districts have to chip in more, while less wealthy districts get a larger share from the state.
So it's designed to kind of level the playing field.
That's the idea. But the critics say that even with this system, it could still put a big burden on taxpayers in less wealthy areas.
Especially if they have to raise property taxes to come up with their share of the money.
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated because sometimes school districts will issue their own WN bonds to raise the money for these matching grants. So that adds even more debt and the potential for higher taxes.
Wow, it's like a whole chain reaction.
It is, and it's something voters need to keep in mind. It's not just about that initial $10 billion. It's about the potential impact on local communities.
Okay, so we've talked about the money. But what about the actual projects? What will this money be spent on?
Well, Prop 2 is pretty specific about that. Some of the key things it focuses on are removing lead from drinking water, which is a big problem in some older schools, creating more classrooms for transitional kindergarten so we can expand early childhood education, and building career and technical education facilities, to help students develop job skills.
So it's not just about fixing leaky roofs and stuff. It's about investing in a wider range of educational goals.
Exactly. And it also includes things like improving school safety, making schools more accessible for students with disabilities, upgrading technology. It's a pretty broad approach.
It sounds really ambitious, but are there any areas where Prop 2 falls short? What are some of the criticisms, even from people who support the idea of investing in schools?
Well, we've already talked about the concerns about declining enrollment and the potential for higher property taxes. But another big criticism is about equity.
Equity, right. That's always an important consideration.
Absolutely. And even some people who like the overall idea of Prop 2 worry that it doesn't do enough to help the school districts that need it the most, the ones in lower income communities.
So they're saying that even though the matching grant system is supposed to help those districts,
It might not be enough to really level the playing field because there are such big differences in property wealth across California.
so those poorer districts could still end up struggling.
Exactly. And that's where that potential lawsuit comes in. Remember, we talked about that earlier.
Yeah, the one from that nonprofit law firm, Public Advocates.
Right. They're basically saying that the funding formula in Prop 2 might actually violate the California Constitution because it doesn't guarantee equal educational opportunities for all students.
So even if Prop 2 passes, it could end up tied up in court for years.
Exactly. And this whole thing highlights a bigger tension in education policy, the tension between local control and state oversight. California has this tradition of letting local school boards make decisions about spending. But the state also has a responsibility to make sure all students have access to a good education, no matter where they live.
And Prop 2 seems to be right in the middle of that debate.
It is, and it's a debate that will likely continue even after the election is over.
We've covered a lot of ground here, the financial arguments, the equity concerns, even the legal stuff. But I feel like something's missing. We've heard from the experts, the analysts, all the big names. But what about the people who are actually living this every day?
You're right. We need to hear from the students, the teachers, the parents. They're the ones who really know what's going on in California schools.
Exactly. What are they experiencing? What are their hopes and fears about Prop 2?
Well, it's a mixed bag, for sure. Some students, especially those who go to older schools that haven't had a lot of funding, they're really passionate about the need for change. They talk about leaky roofs, cramped classrooms, outdated technology, all things that make it harder to learn.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's got to be tough to feel motivated when your school is literally falling apart around you.
And for teachers, it's even tougher. They're trying to do their best for their students, but they're often working with limited resources in facilities that just aren't up to par.
I've heard stories about teachers using their own money to buy supplies, or trying to teach in classrooms that are freezing in the winter or sweltering in the summer. It's amazing how dedicated they are, but it also shows you how bad the situation is.
And then there are the parents. They're the ones who have to worry about whether their kids are safe at school, whether they're getting a good education. It's a lot to weigh, especially when you add in the financial side of things.
Yeah, no wonder people are having a hard time deciding how to vote on Prop 2.
It's a really complex issue. Even within families, you might have people who feel differently about it.
Some parents see it as a necessary investment in the future. Others worry about the cost, whether it's worth it.
And a lot of people are just skeptical. They've seen California make promises before, promises that haven't always been kept.
I get it. It comes down to trust, doesn't it? Do voters trust that the money will be spent wisely? That it will actually make a difference for students and teachers?
That's the key question. And honestly, that trust has to be earned through transparency, accountability, a real commitment to fixing the problems in our schools.
Well said. So here we are at the end of our deep dive into Prop 2. We've looked at it from all angles, heard all the arguments. But now the decision is in your hands, the voters. We encourage you to keep learning, keep talking about this, and make the choice that feels right for you.
No matter how you vote, we hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of what's at stake.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. But that's why it's so important to be informed. Thanks for joining us.